$2 billion. Gone. In a single weekend. And the man who took it was not a hacker, not a criminal organization, not a foreign government. He was the chairman of the bank. His name was on the building. His photograph was in the lobby. His signature was on every document. His face appeared at every shareholder meeting, telling depositors their money was safe. And then, on a Friday afternoon, he boarded a private plane. Destination, Switzerland. He checked into a chalet in the Alps. He ordered room service, and he never came back. While he was eating dinner in the mountains, his bank was collapsing. Employees who had trusted him were losing their jobs. Depositors who had believed him were discovering that the money they thought was safe had been borrowed. By him, from them, without asking. $2 billion, borrowed from his own bank, by the man who ran it. Stay with me, because the way he did it is one of the most audacious acts of financial self-destruction ever documented. And the ending is not what you expect. His name was João Marcos Vasconcelos, and for almost a decade, he was the most powerful private banker in northeastern Brazil. Banco Mercantil de Pernambuco had been founded by his family in the 1960s. By the time João Marcos took the helm in the mid-1980s, it was a respected regional institution with branches across Pernambuco and Paraíba. It held the deposits of businesses, municipalities, pension funds, and ordinary families who had banked with the Vasconcelos family for generations. It was not the largest bank in Brazil, but in the Northeast, it was trusted. And João Marcos understood something about trust that most people never think about. Trust is invisible until it breaks, and while it holds, it can be used. The mechanism he used was not sophisticated by the standards of global financial fraud. It was almost embarrassingly simple, and that simplicity is what made it possible to sustain for years without detection. Banco Mercantil de Pernambuco had a treasury operation. Like every bank, it held customer deposits and invested them to generate returns. The treasury managed the investments, the overnight placements, the government securities, the interbank loans. João Marcos controlled the treasury. He controlled the bank, he controlled the accounting, and he controlled the auditors. What he did was straightforward. He instructed the treasury to make loans to companies he controlled. Companies that existed on paper. Companies with addresses, with tax numbers, with the legal appearance of legitimacy. Companies that had been created specifically to receive loans they would never repay. The loans were recorded on the bank's books. They appeared as assets, performing assets, assets generating interest income that was recorded as revenue. The bank's balance sheet showed a healthy institution with a diversified loan portfolio, generating solid returns. None of it was real. The companies were shells, the loans were transfers, the interest income was fabricated, and the $2 billion that had moved from depositor accounts through the treasury into João Marcos's shell companies was gone. The question that investigators would later spend years trying to answer was how long this had been going on and how it had survived scrutiny for so long. The answer to the first question was between 7 and 9 years. The answer to the second question revealed something important about how banking regulation actually works in practice rather than in theory. Banking regulation in Brazil in this period, as in most countries, relied primarily on document review rather than on substantive investigation. The Central Bank of Brazil received regular financial reports from Banco Mercantil. Those reports showed a bank that was adequately capitalized, generating reasonable returns, with a loan portfolio that looked standard on paper. The examiners who reviewed those reports were not conducting fraud investigations. They were checking compliance with reporting requirements. The reports complied. The fraud was in what the reports described. The shell companies had tax numbers and addresses. If an examiner had visited those addresses, they would have found empty offices or non-existent buildings. But examiners did not visit addresses. They reviewed documents, and documents can be created by anyone with a printer and a notary. The auditors who certified Banco Mercantil's financial statements faced a similar limitation. Audit procedures in this period relied heavily on bank-provided information. Confirmation of loan balances was typically obtained by sending confirmation requests to borrowers. João Marcos controlled both sides of that confirmation process. The confirmation letters came back affirming the loans, because João Marcos's own people sent them back. The accumulation of $2 billion in fraudulent loans did not happen in a single transaction. It happened in hundreds or thousands of smaller transactions over years. Each individual transaction was small enough to fall below the thresholds that might have triggered additional scrutiny. The pattern was only visible when you looked at all the transactions together, and nobody was looking at all the transactions together. By 1994, the Plano Real had stabilized Brazilian inflation and removed the float income that had helped mask the deterioration of the loan portfolio. Without inflation income, the gap between what the bank actually owned and what its books said it owned became impossible to bridge through normal operations. João Marcos had two options. He could go to the central bank and confess, triggering a rescue process that would expose his crimes and almost certainly result in prosecution. Or he could leave. He chose to leave. The preparation for his departure was methodical. In the months before he left, assets were moved offshore. Shell companies in the Cayman Islands and Panama received transfers. Real estate in Portugal and Spain was acquired through nominees. A Swiss bank account, opened years earlier through an intermediary, received the final significant transfer. On a Friday afternoon in late 1994, João Marcos Vasconcelos left his office in Recife for the last time. He told his secretary he had meetings in São Paulo. He drove to the airport. He boarded a flight not to São Paulo, but to Lisbon. From Lisbon, he traveled to Geneva. From Geneva, he drove to a chalet in the canton of Graubünden that had been purchased months earlier in the name of a company he controlled. He was in the chalet when the bank opened on Monday morning. He was eating breakfast when the first signs of liquidity problems began to emerge. He was reading a book when the Central Bank of Brazil received the emergency call that told them Banco Mercantil de Pernambuco could not meet its obligations. The intervention was rapid by Brazilian standards. The central bank placed the bank under special administration within days. The Pro-Air program, which had been established in August 1995 in anticipation of banking crises related to the Plano Real transition, was activated. Depositors were protected up to the insurance limits. The viable parts of the institution were eventually absorbed by a larger bank. The investigation that followed revealed the full scale of what João Marcos had done. 2 billion reais in fraudulent loans, 9 years of sustained fraud, hundreds of shell companies, multiple offshore jurisdictions, a network of nominees and intermediaries that would take investigators years to map. The Brazilian Federal Police issued an arrest warrant. Interpol issued a red notice. The Brazilian government formally requested João Marcos's extradition from Switzerland. Switzerland said no. This is the part of the story that most people do not know. Switzerland's extradition treaty with Brazil contained provisions that Swiss authorities interpreted in ways that made extradition for financial crimes extraordinarily difficult. The specific legal arguments João Marcos's Swiss lawyers made were technical and complicated. They involved questions of dual criminality, questions about the adequacy of Brazilian judicial process, questions about whether the specific charges as framed under Brazilian law corresponded to crimes under Swiss law. The Swiss federal court considered the extradition request for years. João Marcos remained in Switzerland. He was not free to travel internationally without risk of arrest, but within Switzerland, he was effectively protected. He lived in his chalet. He managed what remained of his offshore assets. He grew older. The Brazilian justice system, unable to physically get its hands on João Marcos, proceeded with criminal proceedings in his absence. He was tried in absentia. He was convicted in absentia. He was sentenced to decades in prison in absentia. None of it required his physical presence, and none of it resulted in his physical return. The assets that Brazilian investigators and liquidators were able to recover represented a fraction of the 2 billion. The offshore structures had been designed with enough complexity and enough legitimate legal cover that piercing them required years of litigation across multiple jurisdictions. Some assets were eventually recovered. Most were not. João Marcos Vasconcelos remained in Switzerland for years. The specific details of his eventual legal resolution are complicated by the passage of time and the limitations of the available public record. What is clear is that he spent years beyond the reach of Brazilian justice in a jurisdiction that chose not to deliver him. The employees of Banco Mercantil de Pernambuco lost their jobs. The depositors above the insurance limits lost their unprotected savings. The pension funds and municipalities that had held deposits in the bank took losses. The Brazilian taxpayer funded the deposit insurance that protected the ordinary depositors. And the man responsible was in the Alps. The Banco Mercantil case was one of several regional Brazilian banking crises that occurred in the period around the Plano Real stabilization. It was not the largest. It was not the most complicated. But it was one of the most brazen, because the mechanism of the fraud was so simple and the escape was so deliberate. The chalet in the Swiss Alps became, in the years that followed, a kind of shorthand in Brazilian financial circles for the ultimate destination of money that should not have been moved. When a regional bank collapsed under suspicious circumstances, when a corporate fraud was discovered, when assets disappeared across borders, someone would inevitably say that the money had gone to the Swiss Alps. The Swiss Alps did not create the fraud. The regulatory gaps created the fraud. The inadequate document-based supervision created the fraud. The shell company infrastructure created the fraud. The inadequate international cooperation on financial crimes created the escape. Switzerland has changed significantly since this period. Swiss banking secrecy has been substantially reduced under international pressure. Information sharing between financial regulators has improved dramatically. The specific escape routes that João Marcos used are harder to use today than they were in 1994. But the fundamental conditions that make this kind of fraud possible, the reliance on document review rather than substantive investigation, the availability of shell company structures in multiple jurisdictions, the gaps in international cooperation on financial crime, these conditions have not been eliminated. They have been reduced and complicated. They have not been closed. The chalet is still in the Alps. The mountains are still very good at keeping secrets. $2 billion, 9 years, hundreds of shell companies, one man, one private plane, one Friday afternoon, and breakfast in Switzerland while his depositors discovered their bank was gone. If you believe the public deserves to know where the money actually goes, subscribe. Every week, we cover the frauds, the scandals, and the financial crimes the system wants you to forget.